Good morning, everyone. I think we'll make a start now. Welcome to this talk today, which will be delivered by Rui Ponte Costa. I'm Claire Eatock, and I'm from the Faculty's Industrial Liaison Office. If you have any questions for Rui today, there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you can submit your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, that would be fantastic. And now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Rui, who will talk about neuroscience through the lens of machine learning. Thank you, Rui.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. I'm just going to share my screen. OK, so today I'm going to talk about a bit of neuroscience and a bit of machine learning, and to hopefully give you a feeling for what we do in our group. And the central goal of what we do in our group is to understand the principles of learning in the brain. And the way we tackle this is by using machine learning tools and ideas on one side, and then looking at neuroscience as a problem to solve. So on the machine learning side, we have powerful statistical methods and powerful learning algorithms that we try and use in neuroscience to both understand large and complex data sets that are increasing in complexity with the new techniques that are arriving, as well as trying to address the lack of unifying theories in the field. So our research is mostly on this direction, from machine learning to neuroscience, but hopefully then once we do this mapping, we can use some neuroscience insights to inspire new machine learning algorithms. And in particular, we can represent what we do in these two dimensions. So on one dimension, we have learning from a machine learning, like pure machine learning side of the spectrum, to neural learning, so more close to neuroscience, as well as in terms of the level at which we can address the questions we are interested in. For a more cellular level, where we are interested in how different neurons interact with one another, to a more systems level, where we are interested in looking at how different brain areas interact with one another. And we have a range of people, or we are a range of people exploring a range of questions in this 2D space. Today, I'm going to highlight the work of Joe and Alan, which has been going on in collaboration with Richard Apps, who is a Bristol neuroscientist. So one of the key problems that we are centrally interested in is the credit assignment problem. And that is a problem of how, given a given decision that you would perform at the level of prefrontal cortex, so that sits at the front of your brain, and that's typically where where we believe you perform your decisions. So given a decision that you made, how should you change the rest of your brain? So how should you learn all the connections that you have in your brain across different brain areas? So that you perform better decisions in the future. So how should you assign credits to those connections, given some decision that you made? And that's known as the credit assignment problem. And that's one of the most fundamental problems because we have billions of synapses and connections in our brains. And learning is about changing those connections to become better at performing some task. And credit assignment is inherently locked, because as you receive some sensory input, let's say in your retina, and then this information is processed through the visual streams, and then it ultimately ends up in the prefrontal cortex, there is an inherent locking of this processing of information, right? So a given brain area needs to wait for the previous one to finish so that it can continue with its computation. So there's a forward locking as you propagate information forward, but there's also a feedback locking as you then go from a given brain area to a brain area before it. And these two types of locking are made explicit in deep learning. So deep learning is a type, quite fashionable these days, type of machine learning that of course has a close connection with neuroscience because we use or was inspired in neuroscience to start with, and we used artificial neural networks in deep learning. So in deep learning, this locking is made very explicit because you have to receive some input in your network, and then this arrives at some layer, and this layer and then computes. And only once this layer computes, you can send some activity to the layer above it, and so on, until you end up in the last layer and you perform some decision. So this will be the feed-forward locking, similar to what I just described in neuroscience, or in the neuroscience schematic. But you also have a backward locking. And in the backward locking, because it's in the backward phase that you do your learning, deep learning, this means that you need to wait for each layer to finish so that you can learn or update the layer below. And of course, as you can already probably imagine, if you could break those locks, either the feed-forward locking or the backward locking, you can in principle speed up learning in these networks, because you don't have to wait for everything to be computed, at least not in a perfect way. And that was exactly the inspiration for a recent algorithm proposed by Borg et al., where their idea was to introduce a separate network, a simpler network, that is trained or learns to break these locks. So in this case here, it's being trained to break this backward lock here. And this means that this layer can send it some input and then ask this network for some predictions. So what do you think it's coming from the layer above? And this network is going to send these predictions back, and the layer 2 can continue with this processing without having to wait for the layer above to finish. Of course, I'm just showing 3 layers here, but in most deep learning systems these days, you have many layers of processing, sometimes thousands or even more, hundreds or even more than a few hundred. So you could have many layers here on top, and this means that layer 2 can get an estimate for what's going to happen after it finishes, so on the layers above, so that it doesn't have to wait for those layers to finish. So this in turn means that you can in principle speed up learning in these networks. What we are proposing in our work is that this algorithm is implemented in the brain by a particular and very special brain structure called the cerebellum, which is Latin for the little brain. And cerebellum has more neurons. It's one of the remarkable facts about cerebellum. Cerebellum has more neurons than the rest of the brain combined. So these are neurons that are very densely packed into this structure. And it's typically involved in motor correction, but more recently there's growing evidence that's involved in other domains, not just the motor domain, but more cognitive domains. So it seems to be doing some function that's general across the brain. And what we are proposing here is that cerebellum would function as something like these decoupling interfaces that we talked about, that are unlocking the processing of information in these deep networks. So we introduced this view of the cerebellum as being a decoupling interface, which, for example, here we are suggesting that in the case of the motor domain, receives motor commands and then sends back predictions from those motor commands. So as you make a motor command, that motor command has some sensory consequences, and the cerebellum, what it is doing is predicting those sensory consequences and sending those directly to the brain, so that the brain doesn't have to wait for those to arrive and can compute more quickly. So we applied this model in a set of tasks to demonstrate how well it can capture some elements of neuroscience, and to show that it can indeed be seen as a valuable model for neuroscience. First, we focus on sensory motor tasks, and next we're going to show you some more cognitive tasks. So when neuroscientists do experiments with cerebral patients, they have observed for many decades now that cerebral patients tend to first learn slower, and second, they produce more variable outcomes. So here I'm showing you an example from a study from the 90s where healthy controls or participants were asked to draw lines between specific points. So from here to here, to here, to here, to here, and back to the beginning. And you can see that healthy controls do this relatively well. But when you look at cerebral patients, they produce these more variable lines. It's kind of more wiggle lines, or with more wiggles on them. So based on this observation and other observations, neuroscientists have concluded that cerebral patients learn the task. They can indeed learn the task ultimately, but they do so more slowly and typically with higher variability. So we did a similar task in our model, where we train our model to start from some position and then go to one of 6 positions. And what we see is that the model with a cerebellum, so a healthy model, tends to develop more straight or produce straighter lines, more smooth lines, compared to a model without cerebellum. So consistent with the observations. And on top of this, if you look at the learning, so here I'm showing a learning curve, where on the y-axis is the error being made by these networks. You see that the model without cerebellum tends to learn slower and is also more variable compared to a model with a cerebellum. So this is promising and suggested that these models might be provide a good model for capturing these interactions between cerebellum and the rest of the brain, at least in the motor domain. But then we wondered if we could also apply this same algorithm, same model, to capture some more cognitive aspects. And there is growing evidence in neuroscience to show that cerebellum is indeed involved in many cognitive tasks. So here I'm showing you a summary of those results, where using imaging, King et al., they basically unfolded the cerebellum. So they change the kind of 3-dimensional structure of cerebellum onto a 2D. So they mapped the 3D onto a 2D structure to highlight how different regions encode different tasks. So for example, what they observed was that cerebellum is encoded in many different tasks, represented by the different colors that you see here. And I will just give you some examples. For example, narrative, language processing, and even emotion processing in this region number 7, or word comprehension in this region number 8 here. So this again suggests that cerebellum is doing much more than just motor tasks. So the first task we did then to illustrate that our model can also be used as a model for these more cognitive tasks was an image recognition task. By using a standard machine learning dataset, the MNIST dataset, we trained the model to classify digits. So given some handwritten digit, like for example 3, the model should say this is a 3. This corresponds to a 3 and not a 5 or a 9. And also in this task, we get similar behavior to the previous task. So we observed that the model that has a cerebellum, because it has this inherent decoupling element in the model, we see that there's a faster learning compared to a model without a cerebellum. And on top of this, we also see that the models are more certain about their decisions, which resembles this idea of increased variability in cerebellum patients. Finally, we looked at a language task. So this is a task where, so it's inspired on a task that was also done in cerebellum patients, where people were given images of specific scenes. For example, here we have 2 ladies in supermarkets talking with one another. And in this experiment, they asked both healthy and healthy subjects and cerebellar patients to write descriptions of what they think is going on in these scenes. And so here, just to give you an example, here for this scene, one person said the carrots were not available, neither this week nor next week, or nor next. So you see that's capturing some elements of what's going on, but it's also not quite right. So semantically, there's something weird with this sentence, and it's not, providing a good description of what's going on. So with our networks, we did a similar task where we presented the network with an image and trained it to generate a description of that image. And what we saw again was that a model with the cerebellar component was learning better, so gave a lower error and more quickly than a model without cerebellum. And when we looked at the types of captions that were generated, we get a similar behavior to what was observed in experiments. So for example, here we have, so here in black is the kind of the golden description for this image, which is like the right description and defined by some people. So here we have a large white tropical bird perched on a palm tree. And the model without cerebellum was simply describing this as a white bird sitting on a rock, whereas the model with cerebellum element described this as a bird perched on top of a tree branch. So you can see that the healthy model provides a better, more complete description of the image. And here we have another example, in which again the cerebellum, the model with cerebellum provides a more accurate description. So to conclude, we propose, we give here an example of how deep learning, particular machine learning technique, can be used as a way to bring new models that might inspire a new understanding of how the brain functions. And in particular, we focus here on cerebellum and looking at cerebellum from the lens of deep learning, where we propose this notion that cerebellum is acting as a decoupling interface to effectively decouple information processing across the brain. So I'd just like to acknowledge people did the work, Joe and Ellen, and also our funders, Wellcome Trust and EBSRC. I can take questions now if there's questions.
Thanks. Thank you, Rui. Yeah, we have a question here which says, does neuroscience have slower research progress than conventional machine learning? Because neuroscience usually needs many experiments. It says, in this setting, will the machine learning inspired by neuroscience also achieve slower progress than conventional machine learning that rely mostly on maths?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, it's something I think about myself often. Yeah, it's true that deep learning and machine learning in general progresses very quickly, and recently has moved super quickly, much quicker than I think many people would expect. And that's as this person says, that's due to the nature of the field, right? And how things progress in the field. In neuroscience, you have to do experiments that can take years to get data and to get solid data. So it's a much slower process than in machine learning. But having said that, neuroscience has been around for many decades now, and every day there's new papers coming out in neuroscience, and we should be able to start bringing that data together in a kind of unified way, and that's kind of part of what we are trying to do. So even though neuroscience is slower, there's already so much knowledge out there, so much data out there that we should be able to use. So once we have, in this case, for example, once I have a good mapping between the cerebellum and deep learning methods, we can start now bringing in, by looking at what's known from cerebellum, bringing in inspiration from neuroscience to machine learning. And that's something we're actually looking at. So as a follow-up from this study, we are now exploring this idea that's known in neuroscience, that the cerebellum relies on a very modular structure. So there's many modules in cerebellum that seem to be performing slightly different functions. So we are using that now in these deep learning architectures, and it seems that we're getting even faster decoupling and faster learning by using this inspiration from neuroscience. So yeah, it is slower, but there's so much knowledge already available that we just need to be, I guess, trained to read out that knowledge and bring that knowledge to machine learning.
I've done the classic, haven't I, in talking while I was muted. Another question, which I think you might partly have just answered anyway, was kind of, how do you think this research will develop over the next few years?
So personally, I think this is a very exciting time to be in this field, because now we have, for the first time, we are for the first time starting to map like, for example, recent deep learning developments onto neuroscience data. So there's a range of directions to be taken. So in other projects that we are working on, we are also exploring these credit assignments ideas, but in the context of the neocortex, which is the kind of the outer region of the brain, and how the neocortex performs efficient credit assignments. And there we are finding that the neocortex seems to be performing some types of unsupervised learning, which are similar to some recent developments in deep learning. So again, it's very exciting because that means that for the first time we might have a good understanding of how the brain does some types of learning. So I see this both at the kind of systems level, so where there's a lot to be learned from how different brain areas interact with one another and how different brain areas might be providing a slightly different function. And I think that's one direction to be taken, and that's being taken at the moment by the field, where different people are studying different brain areas and how they can facilitate learning. But of course, then there's the more cellular level. So we can then bring this down to the cellular level and try to understand how different neurons work with one another and how different neuronal types like interneurons, excitatory neurons or inhibitor neurons work together to learn these efficient models. So I think there's a lot of interesting levels and questions to be tackled.
And what do you think you can learn from neuroscience to improve machine learning methods?
So I gave you this example where you can now look at the cerebellum and use the knowledge we have about cerebellum to go back to deep learning to speed up. So when looking at, for example, this project, one of the first observations we made is that even though these decoupling interfaces they look very exciting, in practice they are actually it's hard to make them work, and they can be very, very unstable. And that's because they're trying to learn. So a simple network is trying to learn something that's relatively complex. So we're actually realizing that cerebellum seems to employ specific ideas or principles to make this learning more efficient and make it less unstable. So that's a line of research we're pursuing. So that will allow us to make these algorithms work well and maybe allowing them to be used in the even in the industry environment. So generally, I think that we need to align first some of these algorithms with neuroscience to be able to bring inspiration from neuroscience to machine learning. But there's a lot of exciting directions being taken at the moment. So one of the other directions that people have taken is looking at another brain region called the hippocampus, and now it can, together with the neocortex, help learning. And this has been instrumental for these recent results that you might have seen on training these algorithms to learn to play computer games to a superhuman level. And there, one of the key insights was actually brought from neuroscience to train these algorithms.
Thank you. We have one more question before we bring the session to a close, and that is, in a collaborative field like this, do you think there is a higher demand for people with neuroscience skills or ones with more of a focus on computer science?
I think there is a strong demand for, or strong need for people willing to, to deeply get onto the other side, right? So either, respective of whether you're coming from neuroscience or from machine learning or computer science, I think what's important is that you are willing to delve deeper into neuroscience or machine learning, and there's a lot of people, for example, in machine learning interested in the brain, but more often than not, that's more kind of a loose interest. So they don't have deep enough understanding to understand what's going on. And I think that's where there's the need to make the jump and learn about neuroscience to very deep detail to be able to read papers and understand those ideas and then bring those back to machine learning. So I think it goes both ways, and there's the need for people to interact in both ways.
That's great. Thank you so much for delivering a talk for us today, Rui, and thank you to everyone that's attended and for your questions. As many of you may know, if you've attended sessions throughout the week, this is part of our research showcase, which is really an opportunity to demonstrate research that's like Rui's that's taking place across the faculty. So if anything has captured your interest today, please do get in touch, or we will also be emailing and contacting people after this session with contact details should anyone want to get in touch. So once again, thank you to everyone and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.